Slovakia potentially sees Russia as a historic ally.
One of the major Slovak think tankers told me that while in Poland we historically perceived Moscow and Berlin as our foes, and we saw refuge in London, Paris and Washington. On the other hand, Slovaks perceived Budapest and to some extent Prague or Vienna as hostile, and they looked for refuge in Berlin and Moscow. So these perspectives are completely different.
Yeah. Hello, my name is Nicholas Furnival. You are watching or listening to an OSW interview. Today I'm talking to Krzysztof Dębiec, an expert from OSW's Central European Department. Today we'll be discussing whether Slovakia can be called a pro-Russian country and what its stance is on the war in Ukraine. Slovakia is in the European Union. They have the euro. It's in NATO. It seems like the profile of a very pro-Western country, and yet there have been lots of accusations that it's pro-Russian. Where do these accusations come from, and how far are they true?
Yes, you're right. Actually, Slovakia, quite paradoxically, is one of the countries that seem to be furthest in terms of European integration, being a member of the eurozone. But at the same time, Slovak society, together with the Bulgarian society, in the opinion polls, closest to be called pro-Russian. Of course, it depends on the question that we ask. From the latest polls, it turns out that around 70% of Slovaks oppose delivering any military aid to Ukraine. A huge share of the population fears that it is worse off because the government supports Ukrainian refugees.
So worse off financially, quite
simply. But at the same time, we have to say that the previous center-right government, Hage government and previously Matović government, their profile was far from being pro-Russian. Previous Hage government, center-right government, they put Slovakia in the forefront of support for Ukraine. But at the same time, they had to face unprecedented or in European context opposition domestically. The leader of the party that tops the polls, which is SMER, and its leader's name is Robert Fico.
Mm-hmm.
He's former prime minister.
Currently in opposition.
He's saying that when he takes power, Slovakia will not give any bullet to Ukraine, and his primary aim is to avoid smuggling Slovakia into World War III. To sum up, we have hugely pro-Ukrainian, pro-Kiev government. Now the same can be said about the caretaker government, which is led by Ludovít Odor, who was nominated by President Zuzana Čaputová. And we have Slovak society, which is predominantly afraid of being incorporated into any war conflict or anything like this.
Mm-hmm. Okay, but nevertheless, Slovakia is in NATO, so they must be aware that they are not going to shift alliances. So it's not necessarily a pro-Russian stance. It's an appeal for neutrality. Could I say that?
Yeah, I mean, Robert Fico is literally alluding to the policy which is carried out now by Budapest, by Viktor Orban. And he's saying that neutrality is the best position for a smaller country, which in the event of conflicts between superpowers, and he presents the current Ukrainian-Russian war as the conflict between the West and Russia, because the West supports Ukraine. So for Slovakia, it's best to stay aside, to stay neutral. He also uses the current problems with expensive food and other articles resulting from inflation, saying that he will shift the support being made at the expense of Slovak citizens in favor of Ukrainian ones back to the Slovak citizens, which is, by the way, not true, because the support for Ukrainian refugees in Slovakia, as I've heard, being there, is mainly from outside sources and not from Slovak budget.
Mm-hmm. Okay. So financially, it's more rhetoric than truth. However, you mentioned that Fico said that he could change the policy. It could be dangerous to meddle in superpower affairs. But not too long after the invasion, correct me if I'm wrong, but not entirely connected with the invasion, Slovakia expelled 35 Russian diplomats. Was Slovakia punished by Russia for this in any way which seriously threatens the country or affects the lives of Slovakians?
Actually, that was a sign of determination of Slovak government. Nothing but diplomatic reciprocity in this case was the result of
one-to-one
of this expulsion. Yeah. And it was actually the first time that Slovakia really showed that they want to be part of AntiRussian Alliance. During the Fico times, Slovakia, on the one hand, bought military from the US. They signed contract for F-16s and bought military helicopters from the US. But also Fico and later Pellegrini, his political student, so to say, and who was the next prime minister when Fico resigned, they criticized anti-Russian sanctions, but still they also had to accept they had to agree to them in Brussels, and they also did not want to participate in any actions that symbolically targeted Russia, like after Skripal affair. Sergei Skripal was basically targeted by Russian secret services in the UK. A lot of European countries, most EU countries, expelled, at least symbolically, some Russian diplomats, and Slovakia was back then among the few countries that did not do that, did not decide to follow that example. And the new center-right government that came to power after 2020 elections, they showed from the very beginning a new resilience in fighting Russian influence. We have to remember that Slovakia has been identified by Russian services as one of the primary targets, because using a small parable, Slovakia is a really fruitful soil, and you need just to fertilize it to really bear fruits of it. One of the people close to the previous Hage government told me that Russian activities in Slovakia are around 10 times more intensive than elsewhere in the region. You can see that by the activities of Russian embassy and so on and so forth. And we can, in this point, ask ourselves a question: what makes Slovakia so prone to Russian influence?
Well, that would have been my next question. So, thank you.
So we first have to go back to 19th century. Slovaks were about 1,000 years under Hungarian regime, and especially second half of 19th century, beginning of 20th century, a huge wave of majorization was really felt and had some impact also on Slovak activists back then, national activists. And because of distance towards Budapest, like mental distance that they had towards Budapest, they looked for help elsewhere. And back in the 19th century, Russia was viewed as superpower that can help liberate Slovaks from Hungarian regime.
A sort of Slavic expansionism.
It was deeply rooted in pan-Slavist movement as well. This liberation actually came by the Czechs, and Czechs were the ones who in fact helped Slovaks become independent from Hungarians. But from the very beginning, this anti-Hungarian sentiment, just like the anti-German sentiment of the Czechs, became the foundations of the new Czechoslovak state. And during World War II, Slovakia was a German puppet state. And in 1944, when the Warsaw Uprising broke out, the Soviet Red Army stopped on the Vistula River, but they instead rushed their forces to help Slovak national uprising.
There may be some history that's not entirely clear to the international reader. So the Soviet army did not help Warsaw during the Warsaw Uprising. It chose instead to help the Slovaks.
Yeah, because of the calculations of Stalin back then, of course. And even nowadays, 1944 and 1945, battles of Dukla and liberation of subsequent cities of contemporary Slovakia is widely remembered in Slovakia as a genuine one, not one in quotation marks as we do in Poland, for example.
And several other countries of the region.
Yeah, we can quote Czechia, for example. And they also did not have similar sentiments during 1968 when Prague was basically invaded by Warsaw Pact armies in opposition of the liberal reforms. Slovakia rather used it as used the situation to force through some autonomous regime
within Czechoslovakia.
Within Czechoslovakia.
So there's some interplay between today's Czech Republic and today's Slovakia in this, could I call it balancing?
Yeah, roughly.
So Slovakia potentially sees Russia as a historic ally.
Yeah, one of the major Slovak think tankers told me that while in Poland we historically perceived Moscow and Berlin as our foes, and we saw refuge in London, Paris, and Washington. On the other hand, Slovaks, they perceived Budapest and to some extent Prague or Vienna as hostile, and they looked for refuge in Berlin and Moscow. So these perspectives are completely different.
Yeah. Okay, that's really fascinating. We're not going to shift over to how much Washington, Paris and Berlin were useful as allies. Not during this conversation. Okay, I'd like to shift just a little bit and ask if there are any other factors. And one thing I know I read in a report by you on OSW's website, the fossil fuels are a big, very Russian fossil fuels are very important for Slovakia. And I read that 100% of Slovakia's oil is from Russia, 100%. So are they making any attempts at decoupling?
Actually, it was 100% last year when the war in Ukraine broke out, and it's down to roughly 95% at the moment.
Infinitely more.
And the target is 60% by the end of this year, where we talk about oil. And Slovaks are quite successful when it comes to gas because of numerous LNG contracts, chiefly through the through Croatian LNG terminal in the Kirk Island. The oil dependence in 2020, 2021, 2022 as well was the biggest in the EU. And Slovakia is also among the countries with the biggest gas dependence, with about 85%.
In particular, Russian gas
Yeah.
dependence.
We are talking about gas dependence from Russia. 85% when the war in Ukraine broke out. In terms of contracts and ability of supply, gas was targeted first, and previous center-right government had some limited success in this respect, while in case of oil, Slovakia has more problems, also because refinery in Bratislava is owned by Hungarian MOL group, and being dependent on Hungarian owner, also being a state with no ports, of course, it's a landlocked state, also makes it more difficult. Historically, Slovakia perceived itself as a country being an energetic hub for Europe, but it was supposed to be a hub of Russian hydrocarbons. Slovakia opposed Nord Stream 2 pipeline, not because it was a tool of Russian geopolitics, but because it diminished the role of Slovakia as a transit state.
It was a tool that bypassed Slovakia, quite simply.
Yeah. So it's also like we were in one camp, we, meaning Poland, we were in one camp with Slovakia against Nord Stream 2, but we had a completely different rationale for that. And now Slovakia has to reinvent itself in terms of the strategy for energy geopolitics, so to say.
Okay, so it does look fairly optimistic. The decoupling process is moving forwards. However, on the horizon, we have the parliamentary elections in Slovakia. Is it possible there will be a pro-Russian government voted in?
Anything is possible in Slovakia. There are 6 or 7 parties that can either go or not enter the parliament, depending on last moment swings of moods of voters. And it was actually the case also previously, when the last 6-7 weeks before the election, the support for particular parties changed dramatically. And dramatically, I mean like 10-15 percentage points even. The last winner of parliamentary election in Slovakia, a party called Oliano, being short for Ordinary People and Independent Personalities. They struggled with crossing electoral threshold 2-3 months before the elections, and they finally won it with 25% support. They are now back to a bit 7 or 8, being result of negative assessment of their time in power, but different story probably. That's the one thing, is that we know really little what the final outcome will be. But what each and every opinion poll says is that the winner of this election will most probably be SMER party of Robert Fico.
But probably not achieving a majority.
With around 20% of support, not achieving majority. And most probably the new government will not be a one-party government, but a coalition one, being with SMER, the winner of the elections, or without it. If it's with SMER, and I can imagine myself a coalition between SMER, which is leftist nationalist, it still belongs to European left political family, but it uses nationalist anti-Ukrainian pro-Russian rhetoric, between this SMER party and center-left class of former SMER member and former Prime Minister Peter Pellegrini. So that's one scenario. But Pellegrini, who is not very much in good relations with Fico, can also be appealing for center-right parties, mostly of the liberal nature. And one of the possible scenarios now being discussed in Slovakia is a broad leftist liberal coalition between Hlas, Progressive Slovakia, the party from which President Zuzana Čaputová originates, and Saska, which is Liberty and Solidarity, now member of the conservative European political family, but because of its Eurosceptic tenets in its program. So it's really complicated, and I have a lot of work to do really with Slovak elections.
Well, we will be grateful. It's incredibly complicated and, as you said, very unpredictable. We would really like to have more of your expertise as we come closer to the election. I hope you'll find some time for us too.
Surely.
Okay, thank you very much.
Thank you.
Thank you for watching this OSW interview. If you enjoyed it, please like and subscribe to our channel to keep up to date with all future content.